later, they snuck up behind him and slit his throat. Now, I find this rather interesting that a man who is reportedly so intelligent and has set so many important mathematical foundations for our society today had this totally unreal fear in beings. So much was this paralysis of this fear in something that was not even rational, let alone real, that he failed to see what could actually kill him. And those were the guys with the knives that ended up actually killing him. And I find it interesting that we choose to put our faith in these men who distort and even pervert these things which should have a proper hierarchy to them. And I find that most disturbing. Okay, yeah, I'm good.
Tell me about Aristotle really quickly. Why?
Oh, yeah, right. Do I? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But is it not his philosophy which were absurd and retarded, and his math which was respecting reality?
We don't think
Moderate. We're actually going to get back to that when we talk about Einstein and about beauty. So I'm going to save that one. Now, briefly, before I turn it over, I'll touch very briefly upon Aristotle, who, again, another famous philosopher, mathematician, natural scientist, whatever you want to call it, principle set the foundations for Western development for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, one of his core beliefs was that flies only had 4 legs, and just kind of stated this. And that's really the amazing thing about Aristotle, is that he claimed himself to be a great, man of great discovering, learning, setting these new philosophies in motion, defining the world as it actually was. And yet he refused to actually check up on anything he ever said, wrote down, and we went along with it for hundreds of years. Wouldn't that be scientific evidence he was not using?
Yeah, he's a scientist. What's up with that?
No, he was a philosopher. He was one of yours. He was a natural philosopher. Defined as science. You get your turn. And I'll finish my point. Now, where was it? Oh, yeah. Okay, so in addition to this, it comes to my attention that he also believed that vultures had 3 testicles. Now, again, nothing to back this up whatsoever. Again, we take it for granted. And the fact that scientific principles are based on just mere statements, and we're taking as facts for thousands of years without any real evidence to back them up. Reality and science kind of clash. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. I'll throw out Harrison. You want to add anything?
Well, I get to do something right now. Okay. I have something else to say a little bit later, which is more interesting. But really quickly, I just want to draw your attention to something that was a legitimate science for a long, long time. Alchemy. Do you guys know what alchemy is? Scientists thought that they could possibly create a substance, and they were really certain about this. Like, this was a legitimate field for a very, very long time. They thought that if they could get themselves a philosopher's stone, they would have all sorts of power. Lead into gold, horses into gold, lead into horses, gold into more horses. They thought that was their unlimited potential. And this was a legitimate science until only very recently. Who's to say this isn't going to happen with everything else? I mean, that's not a slippery slope.
Actually, I'm going to cut you off for a second. Thank you for reminding me. I really appreciate it. Okay, everybody here has had enough of first-year logic to know this, so I'm going to go. Okay? Now, when I was in first-year logic, and we went through all the fallacies, by January we were pretty fluent. And one of the ones that stuck most with me was the fallacy of the slippery slope argument, which Dr. Walker made a point of defining, in other words, as the fallacy of the beards. Now, I find it interesting because as he broke it down in his analysis, slippery slope is like a beard. If you have 1 hair on your chin, is that a beard? If you have 2, is it a beard? When does hair on your face become a beard? And clearly, beard is one of the enigmatic things that you cannot define. So, for one of our opponents to actually allow this to exist on his face, just personification, he is wearing fallacy. outside, but inside I'm pure. Pure fallacy.
Where's my towel?
Let that go.
Well, you now have 10 minutes to close the remarks or look at whatever you wish. If you give 10 minutes to the other person.
Oh, do I still have more time?
No.
That's really important to say.
You're going to have to come back to this.
I thought that they already had time before this, though.
You got lots of stuff to talk about.
Well,
As an historian, let me provide our...
They've had more time if this is their turn again.
No, they haven't.
No.
They haven't been able to.
We won the coin toss.
You went to a
Oh, thank you.
Actually, before we get serious again, I'd like to pick up on the Newton, the famous line, if I seen further since I stand on the shoulders of giants. True story. This was actually in a letter he wrote to Robert Hooke. They wrote Micrographia, one of the famous texts that began to introduce the role of instruments so we could see further and deeper into space beyond and into life here on Earth. Newton and Hooke hated each other. Newton despised Hooke. To the point where when Hooke died, Newton, who was the head of the Royal Society at the time, had every single painting, every single document that Hooke left behind destroyed. We don't know what Hooke looked like. However, best accounts seem to suggest that Hooke was a dwarf, or was a serious hunchback. And in the 1680s and 90s, Newton was very upset because Hooke had criticized Principia and some of his other work on optics. And the other sort of big names in the Royal Society, Oldenburg and Wilkins and others, sort of said, we do need to get these guys back together. I mean, they are the foundation of the Royal Society's prestige. We need to have them to agree to get along. And so they urged or persuaded Hooke to write a letter sort of apologizing to Newton, sort of saying, you know what, you might be right on this point or that point, or I can see this issue that we thought about in the past. And this is where Newton's response came from. If I've seen further, it's because I've been standing on the shoulders of giants. It's this beautiful line, not because he thought giants existed, but rather the titans of the field have helped me to see. It's a very sort of conciliatory remark, unless you keep in mind the fact that Hooke was a dwarf. In which case, I've seen further because I stood on the shoulders of giants, and you ain't one of them. True story. I'm not making that up. That's part of the larger story. So, it's not that Newton was imagining that giants existed, or thought they did because he was also great. He was, but not because of that. He was actually a very prominent alchemist. And a lot of his work in religion and alchemy, he spent as much time working on alchemy and religion than in science because he had a curious mind, not because he was absolutely nuts. That came later. That. But the suggestion then is a direct, and actually, if you think about it, rather witty shot at an intellectual opponent rather than an assumption of craziness. I'm troubled by the anecdotal evidence that our opponents have provided, in large part because I think we all know that anecdotal evidence does not empirical proof make. We can pull all kinds of rabbits out of the hat and say, hey look, a squirrel. But that is not going to persuade us that that is a squirrel. Which is troubling. Not least because the notion of science and scientists did not emerge until the 19th century. Aristotle may have been a natural philosopher. I will actually defer to my good colleague as to how we might better identify Aristotle. But the historian in me says to call him a scientist is woefully anachronistic, inaccurate, and empirically unprovable. Newton as well, we cannot call a scientist. But we can recognize within them, and maybe this is where we can reach some common ground, the beginnings of the burgeonings of a new line of inquiry that is based not on strictly the imagination and the imaginary, but based on overcoming these various fallacies, adopting and embracing the Baconian method of developing a scientific method based on empirical evidence, reproducible facts, and avoiding and trying to counteract the very real idols